Picture this: Versailles, 1774. The mirrors that once reflected the glory of France's divine monarchy now reflect something else: decay. The sweet scent of perfume and powdered wigs is drowned by the stench of death. The king once adored as Louis the Well-Beloved is rotting alive, consumed not only by disease, but by the same corruption that has eaten through his kingdom. The king who promised salvation, picture the year 1774. Versailles stands at its peak, a world of gold, perfume, and power. Yet beneath that glittering surface, something festers. The mirrors that once reflected the splendor of France's divine monarchy now reflect decay. And in a royal bedchamber, a man once called Louis the Well-Beloved lies devoured by smallpox, abandoned, shunned, and rotting alive. But to understand how a king adored by millions became the most despised man in France, we must go back to the day he first put on the crown. It was 1715. Louis XIV, the legendary Sun King, had died after 72 years on the throne. His 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, suddenly inherited the most powerful monarchy in Europe. The people saw him as hope reborn, a child who would restore balance after the endless wars and taxes of the Sun King's reign. He was orphaned young, raised among courtiers and scholars who promised to shape him into a perfect ruler. And for a time, he seemed to be exactly that. He learned languages, military science, and the arts of statecraft. He charmed everyone who met him. Even his tutors wrote that France's future shines in this boy's eyes. When he came of age and took full control in 1723, the nation adored him. They called him Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis the Well-Beloved. He was handsome, intelligent, and seen as the opposite of his rigid great-grandfather. The people believed his reign would bring prosperity, reform, and peace. For a moment, it did. He married Maria Leszczyńska, the daughter of a deposed Polish king, a political alliance that also brought real affection. Together they had 10 children. France celebrated stability. Louis XV funded scientific academies, supported philosophers, and made France the cultural capital of Europe once again. But in the glitter of success, the first cracks began to show, from golden promise to rot. Louis XV's fatal flaw wasn't cruelty or tyranny. It was hesitation. He could not decide, could not lead decisively, and so he leaned on those who flattered him. At Versailles, new stars rose: ministers, generals, mistresses, each whispering their own truths into the royal ear. The king's attention drifted from policy to pleasure. The palace turned into a playground of excess. Courtiers gambled fortunes overnight. Silk and scandal flowed through the halls. The monarch who had promised a new age of reason had become the centerpiece of decadence. Then came war. In 1740, Europe erupted in the War of the Austrian Succession. France joined to weaken Britain and Austria, but the conflict was a disaster. 8 long years of bloodshed drained France's treasury and spirit. Thousands of soldiers died, and when the war ended, France gained nothing. The people felt betrayed. Their sons had perished for vanity. The affection once poured on the well-beloved began to rot into resentment. To escape it, Louis turned away from his queen and into the arms of his most infamous companion, Madame de Pompadour, the mistress who ruled a kingdom. Madame de Pompadour was not just a mistress. She was an advisor, an artist, and a political operator unlike any other. She controlled appointments, foreign policy, and the flow of royal favor. Her influence made her both feared and hated. Pamphlets spread across Paris calling her a witch, a temptress, the true ruler of France. The people saw their king as weak, ruled by desire rather than duty. Louis XV's court grew infamous. While the streets of Paris filled with beggars, Versailles overflowed with champagne and masquerades. Every coin the poor paid in taxes was turned into jewels and gardens. Then came another war, one that would destroy France's empire. The 7 Years' War, the fall of France. In 1756, the 7 Years' War began. It was the first true world war, France against Britain, fighting for dominance from Europe to North America and India. Louis XV's armies were unprepared, disorganized, and poorly led. France lost battle after battle. By 1763, the once mighty French Empire was gone. Canada and Louisiana surrendered. The Navy shattered. France's glory humiliated. The people blamed their king. They saw him as a man who cared more for his lovers than his nation. The court continued to feast while families starved. The treasury was empty. Taxes rose again, crushing the poor, while the nobility and clergy paid nothing. Riots broke out in Paris. Pamphlets mocked the king as a living corpse, and in many ways, he was. The same monarchy that had ruled by divine right now survived only by habit and fear. The Enlightenment was spreading through Europe, and philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were tearing down the myth of divine kingship. To them, Louis XV was the perfect symbol of everything rotten about absolutism: privilege, corruption, and waste. The king tried to censor their works, but censorship only made them stronger. The words of revolution had begun to take root. The twilight of Versailles. By the 1770s, the kingdom was collapsing. France was bankrupt, its economy stagnant. Every reform proposed by ministers failed, blocked by nobles or ignored by the king. Louis XV no longer ruled. He drifted. He spent his days hunting, gambling, and entertaining at the Petit Trianon, a private retreat built not for state business, but for pleasure. Then came Madame du Barry, his final mistress, a woman of humble birth, a former courtesan. Her presence at Versailles scandalized the aristocracy and disgusted the people. To them, she represented how low the crown had sunk. Versailles was no longer a palace of kings. It was a carnival of decay. And soon, that decay would become literal. If stories like this fascinate you, the kind where power, vanity, and disease collide, pause for a second. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next forgotten chapter of history's darkest truths. Now, back to the decay of Versailles. Devoured alive by smallpox. April 1774. While staying at the Petit Trianon, Louis XV complained of exhaustion. Within days, a fever appeared, then a rash, then the unmistakable pustules of smallpox. Panic swept through Versailles. Servants fled, courtiers hid, even his doctors hesitated to approach. Smallpox was one of the deadliest diseases of the century, and it showed no mercy, not even to kings. His skin blistered, swelled, and split. The sores oozed and bled. The stench filled the air so thickly that attendants vomited and ran. The mirrors in his room were covered. Louis could not bear to see the horror that his face had become. In the final days, etiquette collapsed. The great palace of Versailles, once the stage of divine monarchy, fell silent. Madame du Barry was exiled by royal order. The courtiers vanished like ghosts. Only a few servants stayed, bound by duty or pity. Louis XV drifted in and out of delirium. He prayed for forgiveness, whispered regrets, and begged God to pardon him. But even his confessor could barely stand the stench. On May 10, 1774, the king who had once ruled over the most magnificent court in Europe died in agony. His final breath came with spasms so violent that witnesses turned away. The well-beloved was gone, unloved, unmourned, and unrecognizable, a funeral of shame. Death did not end the humiliation. Louis XV's body was so disfigured that embalming was nearly impossible. The stench overwhelmed even the priests. The funeral was rushed, his body sealed in lead and buried without ceremony. No grand procession, no mourning crowds. Paris did not weep. It celebrated. Reports say the streets filled with laughter. Bells that once tolled for kings stayed silent. His burial at Saint-Denis resembled a disposal more than a funeral. The coffin was sealed forever, not out of honor, but hygiene. Even in death, the king's body continued to rot, a grotesque reminder of everything France had come to hate. Pamphlets compared him to his ancestor, Louis XIV, the Sun King and the Shadow King. One had illuminated France, the other had decayed it, and the rot he left behind would soon consume the nation itself. The king who made revolution. Inevitable, Louis XVI, just 20 years old, inherited a bankrupt kingdom and a people who no longer believed in monarchy. He did not yet know it, but the revolution had already begun. Not in the streets, but in the hearts of the people, poisoned by decades of betrayal and rot. Louis XV had not caused the storm. He had only made it impossible to avoid. His wars, his debts, his scandals, they hollowed out the divine right of kings until nothing remained but a corpse in a coffin. The Enlightenment had shown the people that kings could die, bleed, and rot like anyone else. The monarchy's divine aura was gone forever. The last image France had of Louis XV was not one of majesty, but of decay. A bloated, fetid body sealed away in shame. It was the death not only of a man, but of an idea. The idea that kings were chosen by God and untouchable by fate. The next king would face a people ready to burn the old order to the ground. Epilogue: the smell of revolution. The story of Louis XV is not one of sudden downfall. It is the story of slow decay, of a system that refused to change until it collapsed under its own rot. He began as a child of promise and ended as a corpse of failure. His death showed the world that even the most powerful empires can die from within, not from enemies, but from their own corruption. Smallpox may have devoured his flesh, but history devoured his legacy. He was the king who made the French Revolution inevitable, the monarch who proved that divine power can rot like any mortal body. Legacy of rot. Centuries later, the story of Louis XV still hangs over Versailles like a ghost. Not for his conquests, not for his palaces, but for the warning carved into his reign. He proved that power without purpose always decays, that when kings forget their people, the people remember, and they do not forgive. Louis XV's death was more than an ending. It was a prophecy. The pus-filled sores that consumed his body were the physical mirror of the monarchy's corruption, a sickness born from arrogance and neglect. Every blister on his flesh was a symbol of France's own infection, greed, privilege, and blindness to suffering. By the time he died, the kingdom had already begun to rot from the inside out. The next generation would not beg for reform. They would demand blood. 15 years later, the same palace that had once banished the smell of death would echo with the chants of revolution. Versailles, the Temple of Kings, would become the stage of their undoing. Louis XV's corpse was sealed in lead, but his legacy leaked through history. He became the emblem of what happens when divine power rots into human failure. The well-beloved who became the well-hated. The king who promised salvation and delivered decay. The monarch whose final breath marked the beginning of modern history. Because when Louis XV died, forgotten, diseased, and unmourned, The world finally understood. No throne, no empire, no crown lasts forever. Only the rot remains. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to uncover more of the dark, forgotten truths behind history's most powerful empires, subscribe and join us as we explore how glory always decays, and how every throne eventually turns to dust.